And now we're moving to another part of the conversation where we are continuing with policy discourse. We will be having join us this morning Muda Yusuf, who is the Chief Executive Officer of a Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprise. We will be having him this morning to adopt initiative and financial strategies to bridge the $14 trillion naira rather 2025 budget deficit. Good morning to you, Mr. Muda Yusuf, and many thanks for joining us this morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Very much welcome. Dr. Muda Yusuf, I beg your pardon. Apologies for that. Yes, so we are talking about federal government to adopt innovative financial strategies to bridge 14 trillion naira on 2025 budget deficits. When you heard of this, what came to your mind?
Well, good morning once again. What came to my mind was the fact that the government is being optimistic about the revenue outcomes for 2025. You know, the government has been undertaking some very rigorous reforms. So between 2023 to 2024, we are having what we could call a kind of transition from one policy regime to the other on account of those reforms, especially the foreign exchange reforms. We have the oil and gas sector reform, which has to do with the fuel subsidy removal. We are currently having the tax reform. Then, of course, we're also talking about the power sector reform. So those reforms took the better part of 2023 to 2024. But now, from all indications, the economy seems to be stabilizing. And once we begin to have this stability, what will follow is the growth and recovery of the economy. So from the optimistic point of view that the economy is on recovery path, I think that is where the optimism was anchored. That's well, yes, we have a deficit of about 14 trillion. If we work hard, we are likely to even, reduce the deficit. I think that is the sense in which the minister was talking.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. Nice to have you on the show. Those optimism are things that are quite very comforting for the populace to hear. But what options do you think are available to government outside of borrowing?
No, you see, currently, for instance, the government is undertaking this tax reform. And the government is optimistic that by the time this thing goes through the process, the tax reform bill is still in the National Assembly. They have concluded the public hearing. So there's some level of optimism that the tax reform is likely to improve the revenue. If the revenue improves on account of those reforms, because don't forget, we still have a whole lot of efficiency problems in the tax environment. Leakages, inefficiencies, corruption, then quite a number of people or businesses that are supposed to be paying taxes are not paying taxes, inadequate use of technology. By the time we put all of those things together, we are likely to see an improvement in revenue. If revenue improves, deficit will reduce. That is one. Secondly, there is a whole lot of efforts to improve oil outputs. The military have been upbeat around that, and oil output is gradually recovering. Because the level of vandalization, disruption, and all of that in the Niger Delta is also, it's reducing. And we have seen oil production go as high as 1.6, 1.7 lately. So if that momentum is sustained, revenue could also improve. And if revenue improves, deficits will drop. Then generally on account of even the economic growth itself, you will see that economic growth is a function of the stability of the economy. And we are beginning to see some stability around the economy, especially around the macroeconomic environment. We are beginning to see some stability in the foreign exchange environment. We are beginning to see some deceleration in inflation. We are beginning to see some deceleration in energy prices. All of these efforts, if that trajectory continues, we are likely to see a better performance of economic operators generally. And if the economic operators are able to do much better, that could also reflect in tax revenue.
Yeah, but doctor,
these are some of the things that I think, because I'm not here to be holding brief for the minister or for the government.
Agreed.
But these are some of the things which I think has informed, the position of the minister.
Yeah, but people have argued also that when, of course, the budget was increased from 49 to 54, that rather than put more spending, that government would actually be using the difference to bridge that deficit gap, but we didn't see that. Are you also not seeing that if more revenue come, we are really going to go on spending spree without really paying attention to the deficits?
Yes, I mean, there was that argument, and I think that argument, is also a very valid argument. Because if we worry so much about deficit, then if we have an opportunity of increased revenue, then we could as well allow the deficit to reduce. I take that point. I agree with you. But the point I'm making is that if the minister is saying that the trajectory or there are some level of optimism in reducing the deficit, I'm just trying to explain where the minister himself is coming from. At least those things on which those optimism have been anchored, which is this positive revenue outlook that is likely to happen. Don't forget, these are projections, these are estimates. There is no certainty about anything. Nothing is absolute. You can only guess. You don't know what variables, you don't know what will happen tomorrow. But based on the facts and the trend that we have, I think that is my own understanding of what the minister, was talking about.
All right.
Okay. All right. So the government is saying that under no circumstance will the CBN provide funding beyond the 5% legally approved contribution to fund the budget. Now, we saw in the past administration times where there had to be a result to the CBN providing funding for the federal government through means and ways. Is that, since this particular administration is not toeing that line, what can we say regarding financial management of this administration?
No, the decision of the administration not to go along that line, I think is a very good one, and I think as much as possible they have been able to stick to it. Now, the options that are open generally, for any government activity, the number one source of financing any government operation is taxation. So again, I come back to the issue of, this tax reform. That's to make the tax system a lot more efficient. Secondly, is to use borrowing, whether domestic borrowing, which is in form of, federal government bonds or treasury bills or whatever. Government uses that a lot, to bridge financing gap. So it could be domestic borrowing, it could be external borrowing. That is another source. The third source is for, the government to leverage on its assets. Government has quite a number of assets. Some of them are idle assets which could be sold. Some of those assets are assets which are in form of investments, like equity, like what government has in the NLNG, all these oil and gas assets. So many assets that the government has. So if we have a proper framework, as we have in many other countries, to optimize the use of those assets, that can give us a whole lot of liquidity, that could enable government to raise revenue. The third point is that government is also talking about public-private partnership. If there are projects that government has, especially in the area of infrastructure, and the government feels that, okay, this project is bankable, in other words, it's something that can be attractive to the private sector, the government can work within the framework of public-private partnership to draw private sector capital to support the funding of some of these projects. So these are some of the ways in which the government can also raise revenue, apart from just resorting to the ways and means, that is resorting to the central bank for purposes of financing its operations. And don't forget, this asset thing, if you do it properly, it can even reduce all this resorting to debt. I mean, we have huge, especially in our oil and gas sector, those assets are not being effectively or efficiently managed. So government has set up what we call MOFI, Ministry of Finance Incorporated. The Ministry of Finance Incorporated is supposed to warehouse all these economic assets and come up with a framework to optimize their use. If you take the example of what happened with the Saudi Aramco, Saudi Aramco is the equivalent of Nigeria's NNPC. Saudi Aramco, because of the discipline, because it's a state oil company, but they had to cut it. There's what we call financialization. They did the valuation of it as an asset, as an investment. They put it on the global stock market. And when Saudi government needed, and right now, that investment is worth close to $2 trillion. When the Saudi government needed some liquidity, rather than go around borrowing, they just sold about 3% of their shares in that Saudi Aramco. And they were able to generate close to $30 billion. That is the value, that is what, optimizing and managing your assets very well. That is what it can do for you, and it will reduce all this desire to borrow and, be worrying about debt service, putting a whole lot of burden on the economy. So the government needs to do a lot more in terms of, managing its assets, so that these assets are not just wasting away or being put in the hands of some bureaucrats that are just making money from those assets. So these are options that we can explore.
Thank you, Dr. Muda. We also have seen that the challenge with PPP has not been quite very, very pleasant in Nigeria. And I think one that been the most successful one was actually the Lekki toll. And we didn't see it really producing as much result until Lagos government had to take that over. Do you see that the fragility of the Nigerian state will really allow a PPP succeed?
Well, it depends on the project. If you look at Nigeria NLNG, it's a kind of PPP. And as we speak, I think it's perhaps the most efficient or the best functioning in terms of PPP arrangement. The federal government has, I think, about 49%. The oil companies have 51%. So for that particular project, the PPP seems to have worked very well, because NLNG is one of the best example of how the government can work with with the private sector, But what has not worked for us well, and I agree with you on that, is the PPP in the area of infrastructure. That has been a whole lot of issue. And I agree with you. The Lekki Ekpe example was supposed to be the model. But along the line, the whole thing was truncated. First, there are issues of sanctity of contract around some of these projects. Secondly, because some of these projects were also long-term projects, and they were also something to be financed, externally. That was also an issue because if you are generating your revenue or your cash flow, you are generating your cash flow in naira, and you have a liability in foreign currency, it's a major risk to the project. Unlike what you have in NLNG, the cash flow is in dollars. The investment is in dollars, so it will be easy to work out. But when you talk about other projects like PPP, if you bring a foreign investor to, look at the number of toll gates that those guys put there. It wasn't realistic. When the Lekki Ekpe thing started, I think the total kilometer length, I don't think it's more than 40 kilometers. And you now put 3 toll plazas. So from a social point of view, it wasn't going to work. But from the financial modeling that they did, that is what can make it sustainable. So the question is that we have to decide, we have to be very, conscious of what can work, especially in this environment, as far as PPP is concerned.
All right, Dr. Yusuf, Dr. Muda Yusuf, thank you so much. I want to quickly ask this question before we let you go. Now, the president, the current president, when he was the governor of Lagos State, when he came into the saddle, Lagos State was generating about 14.2 billion naira. And when he left office, the state was generating about 80 billion naira. And that's because he used the weapon of taxation, and he did well in that aspect. And now he's in the federal saddle. He's also very, very aggressive about taxation. Now, as we speak, there's a target for us to generate about 25 trillion at the end of the year 2025. And much of this will be coming from the aggressive disposition of the chief executive. Are we looking at this as part of what will be used to sponsor or to execute the budget? Because we're going by the level of aggressiveness from the chief executive, looking at the purchasing power of the average Nigerian, it doesn't seem to be at par. What's your take concerning that?
No, you see, the whole essence of this tax reform is to address the question that you have raised. Because what changed the narrative as far as tax is concerned in Lagos State was the efficiency of tax administration, the use of technology to drive efficiency in tax administration. That is what changed the story, the revenue story in Lagos State. So the same thing is what is being replicated in the center, to ensure that there is better efficiency as far as tax administration is concerned. And efficiency will lead to increased revenue. And that is what all this whole idea of tax reform is all about. To optimize the revenue, to make the tax administration more efficient, and to also, eliminate all these archaic laws, multiple taxation, and all some other issues around, the quality of the whole tax system. So it is the same thing that the government is trying to do through the tax reform exercise that is ongoing.
We saw that in this year's budget, the amount earmarked for capital projects is quite significant compared to what we used to have, which is impressive. But the question is there a way to tie some of those, or to ensure that some of those capital projects are able to also generate revenue? And if the government will be, at some point, borrowing to close the funding gap in terms of the budget deficit, should there be a strategy to ensure that that debt is able to generate money to service it and also to repay it? One of the ways that the government was looking at generating money from infrastructure was bringing back the toll system. How do we do this? Are there more that can be done to ensure that money is also generated for some of these projects?
Well, it depends on what kind of projects. If the projects are social projects, we should not be looking towards those projects to be generating revenue. For instance, if you are investing in capital, doing capital investment in the area of security, for instance, in the area of roads, in the area of health and all of that, the primary concern is to ensure first, we provide a social infrastructure to support the citizens. If you are investing in education, the primary objective will not be revenue generation. If you are investing in water supply, for instance, the primary objective will not be to generate revenue. You know, if you are investing in roads or train or power sector, yes, indirectly it may lead to revenue generation because it improves productivity in the economy. So when government is spending, the primary purpose is not should not be about revenue generation. Of course, you can talk about cost recovery. You can talk about improving productivity in the economy. And if productivity increases generally in the economy, then of course revenue eventually come. But it's not a straight line thing that you are doing this because you want to generate revenue. Indirectly, yes, it will ultimately increase productivity and therefore improve, revenue generation by way of taxation. That for me, I think is the bigger picture that we should be looking at. And I agree with you, whatever, especially with respect to borrowing, if you are borrowing, there must be something to show for the borrowing. So that is why it is good that whatever we borrow has to be tied to specific projects that we can see, especially projects that can support productivity in the economy. Because right now, productivity is a very big issue for this economy. And if the economy doesn't have a reasonable level of productivity, the economy cannot be competitive. We have to struggle to compete with at the regional level, at the continental level, at the global level. We'll not be able to export because our cost of production is high. So that, for me, I think is the primary objective of what government capital spending should be focused on.
Thank you so much, Dr. Muda Yusuf, the Chief Executive Officer, Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprise. We appreciate your time with us on the show today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.